to 200 200. You'll get a text confirming entry plus iHeartRadio info. Standard data and message rates apply. That's luck to 200 200. This is the Ross Kaminsky Show. Now, Ross Kaminsky on Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm pretty sure it's Wednesday, and a big congratulations to the Colorado Rockies. They can thank me for not talking about them in the Ross Report yesterday for their winning what was, the longest playoff game in Wrigley Field history. The longest, what do they call it, like single elimination kind of game? Those haven't been going on that long, these one-game playoffs. So it's the longest one of those in history. And what else? It was in baseball history, it was also the longest win or go home game, right? It was the longest playoff game in which if you win, you keep going, and if you lose, you're done for the year. 4 hours and 55 minutes, 13 innings. I had to go to sleep after about 10, maybe top of the 11th or something. It was getting kind of late for me. So, and just being someone who's used to seeing my teams let me down, although I shouldn't really feel that way because Broncos won a Super Bowl recently and the Capitals won the Stanley Cup last year, so I should probably feel better than I do. In any case, congratulations to the Colorado Rockies. They won 2-1 in 13 innings in a really fantastic, historic game. I watched a lot of the game. I don't watch a huge amount of baseball, but I watched a lot of the game. It was a wonderful game. And think about this, though. The Rockies had to go to L.A., and then they had to travel to Chicago the very next day to play another game. Now they've played a 5-hour game, which really went into today, into Wednesday. So they get today off, but then they have to play tomorrow in Milwaukee. Can you?
Holy cow!
Exactly. Wanted to get a little Harry Carey in, partly because he's awesome, partly because I heard him lots of times when I lived in Chicago and went to Wrigley Field, which is the best place to watch a baseball game. I mean, Coors Field is fine. Wrigley Field is special. Sorry. But I was rooting for the Rockies. Not the Cubs. So anyway, congratulations to the Rockies. We'll see how they do in the National League Division Series against the Brewers. All right, we got just a tremendous amount of stuff to talk about today. And I actually would like to, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I want to start with this kind of random off-the-wall thing. There was, I don't even know where it was, a little gathering of some media types navel-gazing and talking about media stuff. And you all know that I think one of the most ridiculous people in media these days is Brian Stelter, who is CNN's own media critic, who is never critical of CNN. Whereas, for example, Howie Kurtz on Fox, if Fox does something that he thinks is wrong, he'll mention it on the show. Brian Stelter is never willing to admit that CNN, which does stuff wrong all the time, pretty much never does anything wrong, and he's just an absolute shill for liberals and bad media everywhere. He's just terrible. So they've got this panel going, and as you look at the screen, on the left side, they've got Ted Koppel, one of the most veteran journalists ever. And on the right side, it's a 5-person panel, right? So all the way on the far left on the screen is Koppel, and all the way on the far right is Brian Stelter. And they start talking about cable TV ratings. So you've heard, and I'm not going to play this audio for you, but you've heard President Trump often saying that cable TV ratings would be terrible without him. And you even heard him say just the other day that he thinks the New York Times and the Washington Post, and to the extent that cable television networks ever endorse people, he thinks they're all going to endorse him because he knows that they know that their ratings and their subscribership and their online viewership and what all these metrics will plummet if he's not president. And so Ted Koppel, who is nobody's idea of, a Fox News, of Sean Hannity, of a conservative, of a right-wing kind of person, raised this question about the impact of President Trump on ratings. And I thought it was just wonderful.
Oh, the ratings are up. It means you can't do without Donald Trump. You would be lost without Donald Trump.
Well, that is what he says.
Chad, you know that's not true. CNN's ratings would be in the toilet without Donald Trump.
You know that's not true. You're playing for laughs. You've lived through enough presidencies to know there will be more presidents.
So you heard Brian Stelter there, and I'm not done with that. You heard Brian Stelter there telling Ted Koppel that Ted Koppel was not being serious, that he was playing for laughs by saying that the cable TV networks can't do without Donald Trump. Now, before you hear what comes next, which has a little bit of data in it, which is rather, I'm not going to say the direction was surprising, but the magnitude is surprising. You'll hear in a second. Who do you think has the better side of that argument? Right? It's not a tough call, right? And it just goes to show, to reinforce what I said about Brian Stelter, the guy is worthless. The guy is, he's dishonest. He will only say things that he believes help him or CNN or other leftists. And, for a media critic job in particular, if you're going to be a critic of anything, in that sense of the use of the word critic, right? I am a professional critic. I'm a restaurant critic. I'm a movie critic. I'm a media critic, whatever it is. You've got to be honest. If all you are is critical, in the negative sense of that word, right? If all you ever do is just say bad things, or just say bad things about people of a political stripe that you don't share, then no one's going to take you seriously as a critic. And I don't think very many people take this jerk seriously as a critic. But anyway. Oh, Shannon wants me to mention to you we're on YouTube Live right now. If you go to youtube.com, type Ross Kaminsky in the search box, you'll find my channel. It's got my picture in a circle. Click on that, and you'll get to the live video. You'll see me right now. In fact, what I should do is open that up so I can make sure to keep an eye on if you're sending me any comments through YouTube. I will be sure to keep an eye on them. So let me make sure I get that going. Oh, look at that. That's a very salmon-colored shirt. Be sure to keep an eye on. Let me turn that down. There's technology for you. All right, and feel free to send me comments if you want through the YouTube live stream, and I'll keep an eye on it as well. Okay, so let me get back to Brian Stelter and Ted Koppel.
What were the ratings before Trump, and what are the ratings now?
I would say we might be up 20, we might be up 30%, we might be up 40%.
Which is it, dude? There's a pretty big difference between being up 20% and up 40%, right? That's a pretty huge difference. But even if it were only up 20% because of President Trump, think about how much television networks will fight over 1% or 2% of an audience. And now he's going to want to poo-poo up being 20 or 30 or 40%. He's not done.
If we go back down 40%, that's okay too.
Really? Hey, Shannon, can you please call program director Tim and ask him how my job security will be if my ratings go down 40%?
Well, it may not be okay.
Of course it is. No, but hold on. I reject the premise that these networks are making so much money off of Trump and thus we benefit from it.
What? So he's willing to accept grudgingly that the ratings are way up, and therefore, since the ratings are way up, the networks are making more money, and he seems sort of kind of grudgingly willing to accept that, but he's not willing to accept that means they're benefiting from it. At least that's how I heard what he said right there. Listen.
That these networks are making so much money off of Trump and thus we benefit from it.
What? Huh? One more time. I can't believe. No.
Well, it may not be okay.
Of course it is. No, but hold on. I reject the premise that these networks are making so much money off of Trump and thus we benefit from it.
So he says, I reject the premise, blah, 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 and thus. So I think what he's rejecting is the part after and thus, right? He says, I reject the premise that the ratings are up and we're making more money because of Trump, and therefore we're benefiting from it. I mean, really, just how big a moron do you have to be to say, as a guy who is a media critic, who works for a media company every day, how big a moron do you have to be to say, I dispute the premise that just because our ratings and revenue are up, that means we're benefiting? How dumb is this guy?
Tell me for a moment, if you will, let's get away from CNN then, all right? Sensitive subject. Let's go to MSNBC. Is there a moment of the day when they are not focusing on Donald Trump or some intimately related subject?
Hallelujah, Ted. And Ted wasn't really saying that as a complaint or as praise of MSNBC. He's just observing, right? I mean, Ted's an old dude who's been around the media forever. I used to love watching Nightline in the, 80s, Shannon, I think? Started because of the Iran hostage, right? Yeah, and then he got his own shows. I enjoyed that show back in the day. So Ted is just this sort of chairman emeritus of the media world, and he's just telling it like it is. Now, of course, Donald Trump is not being serious when he says that the New York Times and Washington Post will endorse him, but he's making an important point. He calls them the failing New York Times. It was actually kind of funny in the press conference the other day where he acknowledged that he knows that the New York Times is actually doing very well, but it's because of him, right? And it's true. It is because of him. And again, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying it is. And I just wanted to point out to you, because I beat up Brian Stelter on this show from time to time, I just thought this was such a wonderful example of how completely and utterly dishonest Brian Stelter is, where at first he says, no, it's not true that Trump is good for ratings. And then when eventually he's forced to put a number on it and says, oh, yeah, we might be up 20 or maybe 30 or maybe 40%. Well, that doesn't mean we're benefiting. Like, you are as dishonest as the day is long. It really is just unbelievable. Unbelievable. I want to share something with you. I don't want to take a long time on it because, speaking of the New York Times and Trump and all that, it's sort of more of what you would expect from the New York Times, although it's a pretty big story, so I do want to make sure you hear about it. The New York Times put out what they called a special investigation yesterday, and the headline is, Trump engaged in suspect tax schemes as he reaped riches from his father. And I'm not going to read a lot of the details to you. Basically, what it seems that they have is huge numbers of documents and tax returns, not of Donald Trump, but of his father's and or his father's businesses and other documents from Fred Trump's businesses. Fred Trump was an enormously successful New York City developer, right? In fact, the New York Times calls Fred Trump, and I'm quoting, the legendary New York City builder, Fred C. Trump. So there's a couple of main points that the New York Times is attempting to make here. Number one, they claim that Trump received the equivalent in 2018 dollars of at least $413 million from his father's real estate empire, starting when he was a toddler. So that's one point they're trying to make, and this is a long-term play. Okay, this is both a short and long-term play by the New York Times in their role as partisan political activists. Okay, so I want to make sure we're clear. Short term. And the short term's already happening, right? Short term, they're trying to get people talking again about Donald Trump's tax returns, Donald Trump's finances, Donald Trump, how genuine is he, and stuff like that. And keep in mind, that the state government in New York City, Governor Andrew Cuomo, and the Attorney General, and I'm blanking on the name of the current Attorney General because the previous one, Schneiderman, had to resign after the stuff that he did, and there's an election coming up to fill the Attorney General spot soon. But anyway, and then basically every top level of state government there is dominated by Democrats. So we have this headline now, or this is just one of many similar stories. I'm going to pick the one from ABC News. The New York State Tax Department is reviewing allegations that Donald Trump received millions of dollars from his father, Fred Trump, possibly including through tax fraud schemes. So a couple things to point out. The statute of limitations would have run on all of this. There's no way that they are going to be able to charge, even if they thought something was illegal, there's no way they would be able to charge Donald Trump with a crime on any of this. Civil penalties, maybe, very, very difficult to prove. But so that's one aspect of what the Times is trying to do, trying to get Donald Trump tied into more potential legal trouble. And in fact, this is a coincidence because later on in this show, at the top of the 7 o'clock hour, we are actually going to be joined by an attorney, Mark Zaid, who's been a guest on this show before on national security issues, but he's representing a Washington, D.C. restaurant that is suing President Trump for a violation of the Emoluments Clause in the Constitution, claiming that Trump, by being president and owning a hotel with a restaurant and bar and all that kind of stuff, is unfairly competing against Washington, D.C. bars and restaurants, and specifically his. So anyway, the Times is trying to get Trump into more legal trouble. Then they're also trying to get him into more of a long-term pickle two ways. Number one, trying to get people to ask, did Trump lie to us about stuff generally? And number two, and this is really the key, going to the heart of Trump's credibility. I'm a successful, basically self-made businessman. The New York Times is trying to say he's really not self-made. In fact, he barely made himself at all. He really got it all from daddy. That is what the New York Times is trying to do. I think people will kind of see through that, but that doesn't mean it isn't a big story. We'll be right back.
This report is brought to you by Pella of Colorado.
Big problems up north I-25 southbound near Meade. The Nissan Intelligent Mobility can help you navigate around an accident there on the right side. Traffic getting by on the left. And then it's still slow I-25 when you get to Thornton down to 80.